Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you, so let's begin. My name is Sean, and in the last few years, I learned that sometimes the smallest digital breadcrumb leads you to the largest betrayal. And that healing from discovering your wife's affair is less about forgetting what happened and more about remembering who you were before you started making excuses for her distance. If you enjoy stories like this, take a moment to tap the like button and leave a comment on where you're watching from. Let's know ourselves. Now back to the story. I'd been married to Juliet for 8 years when a Netflix notification email unraveled everything I'd been trying to convince myself was just a rough patch in our marriage. 8 years that had started with genuine love and passion, but had slowly decayed into something hollow that I'd been too afraid or too hopeful to examine closely. We met in our early 20s, both of us living in Austin and working entry-level positions in our respective fields. I worked at a construction firm, and she worked at a mid-sized consumer goods company. We'd met through a mutual friends game night, discovered immediate chemistry, and started dating within weeks. The early relationship had been everything you hope for when you're young and falling in love. Constant communication, weekend trips to nearby cities, spontaneous affection, touching each other constantly, stealing kisses in public, that physical magnetism that makes new relationships feel electric. We'd dated for 2 years before getting engaged and married in a lovely ceremony with family and friends. We started our life together in a 2-bedroom apartment near downtown Austin, both of us advancing in our careers as we built our partnership. The first few years of marriage had been genuinely good. We maintained regular date nights, took weekend trips when we could afford them, had active physical intimacy, communicated openly about our lives and our future plans, and supported each other through career challenges and personal struggles. We talked about having kids eventually, about buying a house once we'd saved enough for a down payment, about building the kind of stable, loving family neither of us had fully experienced growing up. Around year 5, we found out that my wife was having difficulties conceiving naturally, so we didn't force it anymore. We bought our first house, a small 3-bedroom in a developing neighborhood. It needed some work, but had good bones and potential. We'd spent weekends together doing minor renovations, painting rooms, and updating fixtures, making it ours. But somewhere around year 6 or 7, things started changing. Subtle shifts at first, easy to rationalize as normal relationship evolution or the pressures of adult life. Work stress increased for both of us. I'd been promoted to a managerial position, which meant longer hours and more responsibility. Juliet had advanced to marketing director at her company, managing a team and dealing with demanding clients. We'd come home exhausted. We would eat dinner while watching TV instead of talking, and go to bed at different times based on our schedules. The spontaneity and passion that had defined our early relationship got buried under routine and fatigue. Date nights became less frequent, maybe once a month instead of weekly, and even those felt obligatory rather than exciting. We'd go through the motions, nice restaurant, polite conversation, home by 10, without the genuine connection that used to make those evenings special. Physical intimacy declined significantly. We went from several times a week to maybe twice a month. And when we were intimate, it felt mechanical, like checking a box rather than genuine desire and connection. I tried addressing it by suggesting we should prioritize our relationship, that we should plan a vacation, just the two of us, and if things don't get better, we could see a couples counselor to help us reconnect. Juliet would agree in principle, but never follow through. When push comes to shove, she would say she was too busy at work to plan a trip right now, that we didn't need counseling, we just needed to get through this stressful period, adding that things would improve once work calmed down. So I'd back off, agreeing that she's probably right, that this was just a phase, that all marriages go through periods of disconnection, and we'd find our way back to each other eventually. I'd sometimes mention my concerns to married friends. They'd say things like it happens after a while, or marriage isn't always exciting, or you have to work at keeping the spark alive. The responses made me feel like I was expecting too much, that wanting passion and connection after 8 years of marriage was unrealistic. that I should just accept this as the natural evolution of a long-term partnership. But gradually Juliet's withdrawal went beyond normal relationship settling. She became increasingly distant in ways that felt deliberate rather than circumstantial. She started staying late at work frequently. She would text around 6 or 7, saying she had to finish a project, and wouldn't be home until 9 or 10. This happened multiple times a week. When she came home those late nights, she'd be tired, saying she'd already eaten at the office or picked something up. Then she would shower and go straight to bed, too exhausted to talk or connect. She stopped initiating any physical affection. No kisses goodbye in the mornings. No touching when we'd pass each other in the house. Just existing in the same space without any warmth between us. When I tried to initiate intimacy, she'd almost always decline. Too tired. Not in the mood. Stressed from work. Had an early meeting the next day. Always a technically reasonable excuse, but it added up to a pattern of complete avoidance. I tried different approaches. I suggested we take a weekend trip to reconnect away from work stress. She said she couldn't take time off right now. I offered to plan date nights where I'd handle everything, reservations, planning, all she had to do was show up. She'd agree, but then cancel at the last minute because something came up at work or she was too exhausted. I attempted to have serious conversations about the distance between us. She'd deflect, say I was overthinking things, that every marriage has rough patches, but we were fine. I rationalized all of it. I never seriously considered she might be having an affair. Infidelity felt like something that happened to other people, to couples with obvious problems. Not to us, despite the growing distance. Then one Tuesday evening, I was in my home office finishing up some project documentation I hadn't completed during the workday. Juliet was in the living room, supposedly watching TV. My phone buzzed with an email notification. Glanced at it casually. A message from Netflix saying a new device had logged into our account. I assumed it was Juliet. Maybe she'd logged in on her phone or her work laptop. We shared the account, both used it regularly. So a login notification wasn't unusual. I finished my work and joined Juliet in the living room about an hour later. Mentioned casually that I'd gotten a Netflix notification. Asked if she'd logged in on a new device. Juliet's response was immediate. She said no. I didn't think much of it in the moment. Just nodded and let it go. But later that night, after Juliet had gone to bed, I looked at the email again more carefully. The device name listed was Samsung Galaxy S22. Juliet and I used an iPhone. Always had. We were firmly in the Apple ecosystem, iPhone, iPad, MacBook. That was odd. If she hadn't logged in, and I hadn't logged in from any new device, who had? I opened the Netflix app on my phone and checked the account settings. Could see the list of currently logged in devices. There was my phone, Juliet's phone, our living room TV, my laptop, and the new device is listed as Samsung Galaxy S22. I logged that device out. Changed nothing else. Didn't change the password. Just removed that one unfamiliar device. I figured maybe someone had gotten our login somehow. We'd probably used it on a friend's TV at some point and forgotten to log out. A few days later, on Friday evening, I got another email notification. Someone had logged into our Netflix account again. Same device, Samsung Galaxy S22. This time I felt uneasy. Once could be explained by various innocent scenarios. But someone persistently trying to log back in after being removed suggested something more deliberate. I didn't mention it to Juliet immediately. Instead, I went through our Netflix viewing history out of curiosity and found titles I'd never watched. Romantic dramas. I had zero interest in them. Shows Juliet had explicitly said she didn't like back when they'd appeared in recommendations before. The viewing times were odd, too. I confronted her that weekend. Kept the tone light while asking who was watching Emily in Paris on our account when she was supposedly at work. Juliet laughed off easily. Said maybe it was my sister. Reminded me I'd given her our login once. But I knew I'd never given my sister our Netflix password. She had her own subscription. This was a lie, and not even a particularly good one. That's when the quiet alarm in my head got louder. I stopped rationalizing away the inconsistencies. I called a close friend who worked in cybersecurity, forwarded him the Netflix notification email, asked if there was any way to trace where the login attempts were coming from. My friend said he could try, asked me to give him a few days. A week later, my friend called me, said he traced the IP address from the login attempts. It was coming from a residential address in a neighborhood across town. He asked if I wanted him to dig deeper, to find out whose address it was. I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to know, because I had already changed the Netflix account's password. But I told him yes. After a few days, my friend called again, said the IP address was registered to someone. The name sounded familiar. My friend asked if that name meant anything to me. I told him it did. Juliet had mentioned the name multiple times over the past year as her coworker. I'd never thought much of it. Juliet worked with lots of people. She mentioned colleagues regularly. This name was just another name in the roster of people she interacted with professionally. But now that name had a different context. As I processed the thoughts in my head and their possibilities, I feel sick. Felt that hollowing sensation in my chest when you realize something you've been denying is actually true. But I didn't want to accuse Juliet without proof. I didn't want to be wrong or blow up our marriage over circumstantial evidence and suspicious patterns. So I hired a private investigator in the weeks that followed. I found someone through an online search, read reviews, and checked credentials. The investigator was a former female police detective who now ran a private investigation firm. I met with the private investigator and explained the situation. She said she'd look into it. She asked for enough time to gather enough evidence to confirm or disprove my suspicions. The next month was torture. I was going through daily routines with Juliet while knowing I'd hired someone to follow her, maintaining normal conversations while internally preparing for what the investigator might find. Juliet seemed oblivious to my internal turmoil. She continued her pattern of late nights and distance. If anything, she seemed more relaxed than she'd been in months. The private investigator called 4 weeks after our initial meeting, said she had her report ready. She asked me to come to her office to review it in person. I took a long lunch break from work and drove to the private investigator's office. The evidence was comprehensive and devastating. Photos of Juliet and this coworker together. Surveillance logs showing Juliet's car parked at this guy's building on multiple occasions when she texted me she was working late at the office. There was video footage the private investigator had captured of them walking closely together, touching affectionately and behaving exactly like a couple who weren't trying particularly hard to hide their relationship. The private investigator explained her findings. Said the affair appeared to have been going on for at least 6 months, based on what she'd documented, possibly longer. I sat there looking at the evidence, feeling numb. Some part of me had suspected. But seeing photographic proof of my wife's betrayal was different from suspecting it. I drove back to the office in a daze and decided to close for the day. I got home before Juliet came home from work, then sat in my car in our driveway for a while. Eventually, I went inside. I tried to act normal when Juliet came home around 7, as I processed what to do next. I went through the motions for the rest of the day. I spent the following week in this surreal state, functioning normally on the surface, while internally processing what I knew. I was deciding what to do with the information. A part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to throw the evidence in her face and demand explanations. At the same time, another part wanted just to leave. Pack a bag and move out without explanation. Let her figure out why her husband had disappeared. But I didn't either. I just waited for the right moment and the right circumstances to have the conversation that would end our marriage. That moment came on a Saturday morning about a week and a half after being sure of my wife's infidelity. Juliet was in the kitchen making coffee. I came downstairs with a folder containing the photos the private investigator had given me. Set it on the kitchen counter without saying anything. Juliet looked at the folder, then at me. Asked what it was with this casual curiosity that suggested she had no idea what was coming. I told her calmly to look inside. She opened the folder, started going through the contents. I watched her face as recognition and panic set in. She gasped, pulled out one of the photos, and stared at it like she couldn't understand how I had it. The first thing she said was, this was insane. That the coworker was just a friend. That whoever took these photos had misunderstood innocent interactions. I stayed silent, just watched her try to explain away photographic evidence of her affair. When I didn't respond to her denials, Juliet's approach changed. She broke down crying. Then, she tried flipping the blame onto me. Said I'd been distant. That I cared more about work than about her. That I'd been emotionally unavailable for years. That she'd needed someone who actually listened to her. And this coworker had been there when I wasn't. I let her finish. Let her make all her justifications and accusations. Then I reminded her that I'd been trying to fix us. That I'd noticed our distance and tried repeatedly to bridge it. But she just hadn't wanted to be fixed. Because she'd been getting what she needed elsewhere. Juliet started begging. Said she'd end it with a coworker immediately. That it had been a mistake. That she loved me and wanted to save our marriage. That we could go to therapy and work through this. She offered everything people offer when they've been caught and are desperate to avoid consequences. Promises of change. Commitments to counseling. Tearful apologies. I told her I needed time to think. That I couldn't just pretend this hadn't happened. Seeing those photos had broken something fundamental in how I saw her and our marriage. Over the following days, I considered whether the marriage could be salvaged. Whether Juliet's betrayal could be forgiven and worked through. I tried to imagine going to counseling, rebuilding trust, and moving forward together. But every time I looked at Juliet, all I could see was those photos. The images were burned into my brain, and I couldn't unsee them, couldn't forget them. Couldn't imagine ever being intimate with her again without those images flooding back. About 3 weeks after the initial confrontation, I told Juliet I was filing for divorce. She tried arguing, said I was giving up too easily, that we'd been together for 10 years total, married for 8, and that our history deserved more effort than this. I told her that I'd put in years of effort while she'd been checking out of our marriage and into someone else's bed, that I was done trying to save something she'd already destroyed. I consulted with a divorce attorney the following week. The attorney explained Texas divorce law. Said infidelity wouldn't affect asset division much, but could influence other aspects of the divorce proceedings. And having documentation of the affair was useful even if Texas was a no-fault state. I authorized her to file divorce papers. Wanted this over as quickly and cleanly as possible. Juliet hired her own attorney when she was served. Someone aggressive who immediately began strategizing to maximize what she would get from the divorce. The proceedings got ugly. Juliet's attorney tried claiming I'd been emotionally unavailable and neglectful throughout the marriage. Hinted that maybe I'd been having an affair and was projecting onto Juliet. But they had no evidence of any affair on my part. Because there was none. I'd been faithful throughout our marriage, even when it was falling apart. The divorce dragged on for about a year. Court dates, mediation sessions, and discovery requests. With back-and-forth negotiations over asset division. We'd accumulated decent wealth during our marriage. The house, retirement accounts, savings, and vehicles. All of it had to be valued and divided. Texas community property law generally mandated a roughly equal division. I lost about half of everything we'd built together over those 8 years. The house had to be sold. Neither of us could afford to buy out the other's share, and neither wanted to stay there alone. We listed it for less than the market price, found a buyer relatively quickly, and split the proceeds after paying off the mortgage. My retirement accounts took a hit. Half of what I'd contributed during the marriage went to Juliet. Same with savings. I walked away from the divorce with significantly less than I'd entered the marriage with financially. The cost of ending things with someone who'd betrayed me. But the emotional cost would have been higher if I'd stayed. The divorce was finalized, and I moved into a one-bedroom apartment across town. It was just somewhere to live while I figured out who I was again as a single man. I unfollowed Juliet on all social media immediately. Blocked her number and other forms of communication. I didn't want to know what she was doing after I reported her affair to the HR in her company, whether she was still with her coworker, if she was fired or suspended, what her life looked like post-divorce. None of it was my business or my concern anymore, because I knew that checking would just reopen wounds. It would keep me tethered to someone I needed to move on from completely. I told friends explicitly not to update me about Juliet. The first few months after the divorce were brutal. I would wake up reaching for someone who wasn't there. I would replay the memorable moments in my head, analyzing our entire relationship, looking for signs I'd missed, wondering when precisely she checked out emotionally. When the affair had started, how long had she been lying to me? I focused on healing, on rebuilding a life that was mine alone rather than shared with someone who'd betrayed me. Looking back now, almost 2 years since that Netflix notification email started unraveling everything, I understand what happened much more clearly. I learned that minor signs of distance and withdrawal aren't always just phases. When someone consistently pulls away, emotionally and physically, they're telling you something important, even if they're not saying it explicitly. I learned that too tired, too stressed, and too busy are constant excuses for avoiding intimacy that often mask deeper problems. That Juliet's exhaustion wasn't really about work. It was about investing her emotional and physical energy elsewhere. I learned that when someone becomes defensive about simple questions, like whether they logged into Netflix, they're often hiding something. Those disproportionate reactions signal guilty consciences. I learned that affairs don't always start with obvious signs. That Juliet didn't suddenly become distant. The distance had built gradually over time. The affair was a symptom of a disconnect that had been developing for months or years. Most importantly, I learned that you can't fix a marriage alone. That all my attempts to reconnect, all my suggestions for counseling and date nights, all my patience with her distance, none of it mattered because Juliet had already checked out emotionally. Some people still ask if I regret not trying harder to save the marriage after discovering the affair. Suppose I should have given Juliet's offers of counseling a chance. The answer is no. Not because I'm bitter or unforgiving, but because those photos made clear that whatever we'd had was already dead. Juliet hadn't made some impulsive mistake. She'd been conducting a sustained affair, had been lying to me for months. She had been investing in another relationship while withdrawing from ours. That's not something you counsel your way through. That's fundamental betrayal that destroys the foundation our trust is built on. I don't regret the divorce. I don't regret losing half my assets to end things with someone who'd betrayed me so completely. My only regret is the years at the end when I ignored the warning signs and rationalized her distance rather than confronting it directly, where I let hope blind me to reality. But even those years taught me valuable lessons about trusting my instincts, about not accepting excuses that pile up into patterns, about recognizing when someone has checked out emotionally. That's my story. That's my truth. And while the healing continues, I'm finally at peace with how everything happened. Because sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the best new beginnings. And I'm building something better now than what I lost.